The morning sun blazed mercilessly over Edwards Air Force Base, turning the tarmac into a shimmering mirror of heat. Lieutenant Rachel Quinn adjusted the faded medic patch on her flight suit sleeve as she walked the perimeter of the flight line, her boots scuffing against concrete that was already too hot to touch comfortably. The patch had once been crisp navy blue, but months of California sun and desert wind had bleached it to a dull gray, much like her prospects, she sometimes thought. She paused beside a grounded F-35B Lightning II, its sleek frame gleaming like a predator at rest. Her reflection wavered in the polished fuselage, distorted and small. Once, she dreamed of seeing herself in that cockpit for real, not just as a passenger on medical transport runs or training observer flights. That dream felt like a lifetime ago. "Quinn, get over here." Staff Sergeant Marcus Blake's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Rachel turned to see him standing near the nose of another F-35B, his pristine flight suit unmarked by the dust that seemed to cling to everything else on the base. His boots shone despite the gritty conditions, and his grin was wide and predatory. As he gestured toward her, "Look what we've got here, boys," Blake called out to the cluster of pilots gathering for morning briefing. "Our resident bandage wrapper thinks she belongs near the real birds." His voice carried that particular tone of mockery that made Rachel's jaw tighten loud enough for everyone to hear, casual enough to seem like harmless ribbing. Captain Derek Stone, Blake's usual sidekick, joined in with a theatrical shake of his head. "Maybe we should strap a first aid kit to the wing. Quinn here could perform emergency surgery at Mach 2. The group erupted in laughter, the sound echoing off the hangar walls. Rachel felt the familiar burn of humiliation in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She'd learned that reacting only made it worse. Instead, she checked the medical kit slung over her shoulder and continued her walk toward the hangar, their laughter following her like smoke. What Blake and the others didn't know, what nobody bothered to ask, was that Rachel Quinn hadn't started as a medic. 3 years ago, she'd been Lieutenant Quinn, fighter pilot trainee, ranking third in her class at pilot training school. She'd logged over 200 hours in trainers, mastered every simulation thrown at her, and earned commendations for her precision flying. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was during a routine training exercise with Major Harrison Wells, one of the base's senior instructors. Rachel had noticed irregularities in the hydraulic pressure, readings during pre-flight check, subtle fluctuations that the older pilot dismissed as sensor quirks. But Rachel had documented every anomaly, double-checked the maintenance logs, and insisted on a thorough inspection. Major Wells had not appreciated being questioned by a trainee. When Rachel filed an official report citing safety concerns, Wells accused her of insubordination and excessive caution unbecoming of a fighter pilot. The hydraulic system failed catastrophically during the next training flight with Wells and another student aboard. They barely made it down alive. Rachel had been right. The investigation proved it. But Major Wells was a decorated veteran with connections throughout the command structure. When the dust settled, Rachel found herself reassigned to better suit her observational skills and attention to detail. Military speak for being shuffled off to medical support. Her flight clearance wasn't revoked outright, but it was buried under layers of bureaucratic red tape and pending reviews that never seemed to conclude. She was qualified to fly, but not authorized. Trained to fight, but relegated to healing. She'd gone from pilot to medic not by choice, but by consequence of being right at the wrong time. Now, as Blake's laughter faded into the morning routine, Rachel made her way to the medical station. The small building squatted between two massive hangars like an afterthought, its air conditioning unit rattling against the desert heat. Inside, the familiar smell of antiseptic and medical supplies greeted her, clean and sterile, the opposite of the aviation fuel and hot metal that still made her heart race. She began her daily inventory, checking supplies and reviewing emergency protocols. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, but her mind wandered to the flight simulators she visited after hours. The old S-pods in Bay 7 weren't much to look at. Scratched canopies, worn seats, outdated displays, but they still flew like the real thing in her hands. Night after night, Rachel ran combat scenarios in those forgotten simulators. She practiced emergency procedures, mastered weapon systems, and flew missions that no one assigned her. The maintenance crew had noticed. Tom Rodriguez, a veteran mechanic with 20 years under his belt, had watched her through the bay window one evening. "She moves like a pilot," he told his partner quietly. "Hands know exactly where to go. Most people fumble around in there for minutes before they find the basic controls. She's got the touch." But having the touch and having the chance were two different things entirely. As Rachel finished her morning routine, the loudspeaker crackled to life with the day's flight schedule. Blake's name was called for a training mission. Stones for air-to-air combat practice. A dozen other pilots received their assignments, their voices confident as they acknowledged their orders. Rachel's name was not called. It never was. She looked out through the medical station's small window at the flight line, where the F-35Bs sat like sleeping giants, their potential energy coiled and waiting for the right hands to unleash it. The morning light caught the vapor trails of jets already airborne, scratching white lines across the desert sky. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Blake's voice carrying on the wind. And that's how a real pilot handles turbulence, not like some people who jump at every little sensor reading ... Rachel closed her eyes and took a deep breath. The smell of aviation fuel drifted through the window, mixing with the antiseptic scent of her small domain. She'd been invisible for 3 years now, dismissed and overlooked. But she was still here, still ready, still dreaming of the day when being right would matter more than being liked. That day was coming sooner than anyone imagined. The heat shimmer rising from the tarmac made the distant mountains dance like mirages as Rachel completed her morning medical checks. The weather briefing had been ominous: high winds, low humidity, and temperatures climbing toward triple digits. Perfect conditions for the wildfires that had been threatening the region for weeks. She was restocking the trauma bay when the first emergency call came in over the radio. A civilian aircraft had made an emergency landing at a small airstrip 60 miles east, reporting engine failure and possible injuries aboard. The voice crackling through the speaker was tight with controlled panic. "Edwards Base, we need immediate medical evacuation. 2 passengers, one with chest trauma, another with possible spinal injury." Within minutes, the base medical helicopter was spinning up, its rotors cutting through the thick air. Rachel grabbed her field medical kit and ran toward the landing pad, her boots pounding against the scorching asphalt. This was what she lived for, moments when her skills mattered more than anyone's opinion of her. As she approached the helicopter, she nearly collided with Blake, who was heading toward his F-35B with his characteristic swagger intact. He paused, looking at her with barely concealed amusement. "Off to play doctor again, Quinn?" He called out over the rotor noise. "Try not to let them die while you're figuring out which end of the bandage to use." Rachel bit back her response and climbed into the helicopter. As they lifted off, she could see Blake through the small window, standing beside his fighter jet with his arms crossed, probably making jokes to his squad mates about the flying ambulance service. The emergency rescue took 4 hours. Rachel worked steadily in the cramped confines of the damaged civilian aircraft, stabilizing the chest trauma patient and carefully immobilizing the spinal injury case before they could be safely transported. The pilot, a retired Air Force colonel named Frank Morrison, watched her work with growing respect. "You've got steady hands," he told her as they waited for the medical helicopter to return for the second patient. "And good instincts. I've seen combat medics with less composure." "Thank you, sir," Rachel replied, checking the chest patient's vital signs for the dozenth time. "You know," Morrison continued, his voice thoughtful, "you carry yourself like a pilot. The way you moved around the aircraft, checking systems, reading the damage, that's not something they teach in medical school." Rachel's hands stilled for a moment. "I had some flight training, sir, before my current assignment." Morrison nodded slowly. "Things don't always work out the way we plan, do they? But skills like yours don't just disappear. They wait." By the time Rachel returned to base, the sun was setting behind a wall of smoke on the horizon. The wildfires were spreading faster than predicted, driven by winds that seemed to grow stronger by the hour. She could taste ash in the air as she walked back to the medical station, her uniform stained with dust and sweat from the rescue operation. Inside the pilot's lounge, she could hear Blake holding court, his voice loud and animated as he recounted his afternoon training mission. "Pulled 7 Gs in that last turn, smooth as silk. That's what separates the real pilots from the pretenders. Some people think flying is just about following procedures and checking every little detail, but it's really about instinct, about having the right stuff." Rachel passed by without stopping, but she caught Stone's response. "Speaking of pretenders, did you see Quinn running around earlier with her little medical bag? Acting like she's some kind of hero because she put band-aids on a couple of tourists." Their laughter followed her down the hallway, but tonight it stung less than usual. She'd spent the day saving lives while they'd spent it practicing maneuvers they'd likely never use in combat. She knew which had more value, even if they didn't. In her quarters that night, Rachel spread out the technical manuals she'd been studying in secret. Flight procedures, emergency protocols, combat tactics, all the knowledge that had once been her specialty, now relegated to personal research. She traced her finger along a diagram showing optimal flight paths through hostile airspace, her mind automatically calculating angles and fuel consumption. Her old call sign was still visible on one of the manual covers, faded but readable: Phoenix. She'd earned it during training after successfully recovering from a simulator emergency that had killed 3 other students. Like the mythical bird, she'd risen from the ashes of failure and flown again. Now, as smoke drifted past a window and the smell of distant fires grew stronger, Rachel wondered if she'd ever have the chance to live up to that name again. The wildfires were getting closer, and she could feel something building in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Outside, she could hear the night shift mechanics working on the F-35BS, their tools ringing against metal, as they prepped the fighters for whatever tomorrow might bring. The base was ready for action, but the pilots who would take these magnificent machines into the sky had shown more interest in their own egos than in the growing threat beyond the perimeter. Rachel closed the manuals and prepared for bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The wind rattled her windows, carrying with it the scent of smoke and the promise that tomorrow would test them all in ways they couldn't yet imagine. In the distance, she could see the orange glow on the horizon growing brighter. The alarm shrieked through the pre-dawn darkness at 0400 hours, jolting Rachel from restless sleep. Emergency lighting flooded the barracks hallways as personnel rushed to dress and respond. Through her window, she could see the orange glow on the horizon had grown closer, angrier, painting the night sky in shades of hell. The base intercom crackled to life. All personnel to emergency stations. Wildfire has jumped the eastern perimeter. Civilian evacuation in progress. This is not a drill. Rachel threw on her uniform and grabbed her medical kit, muscle memory guiding her through the routine she'd practiced hundreds of times. As she stepped outside, the smell of smoke hit her like a physical blow-thick, acrid and carrying the bitter undertones of burning structures. Ash fell like gray snow, dusting everything in a fine coating of destruction. The command center buzzed with controlled chaos. Maps covered every available surface, marked with red zones showing the fire's advance. Radio chatter filled the air, evacuation updates, resource requests, damage reports. Rachel found her station at the triage area, where incoming casualties from the evacuation zone would be processed. Commander Patricia Walsh, the base medical officer, briefed the medical team with clipped efficiency. "We've got a civilian convoy trapped beyond Ridge Point, approximately 40 vehicles, including families with children and elderly residents. The fire jumped the access road about an hour ago. They're boxed in with no ground route out." The tactical display showed the problem clearly. The convoy was surrounded by advancing fire lines, trapped in a valley with steep walls and only one viable exit, now blocked by flames that reached heights of over 100 feet. The smoke was so thick that ground rescue was impossible. "We need air support to mark a safe corridor," Walsh continued. "Someone has to fly through that smoke and guide them out before the fire closes the circle completely." In the adjacent briefing room, the fighter pilots gathered for their mission assignments. Rachel could see them through the open doorway. Blake, Stone, and the others, all studying the same tactical maps with expressions that ranged from concerned to openly worried. The fire presented challenges that no training had fully prepared them for. Zero visibility conditions, unpredictable updrafts, temperatures that could damage aircraft systems, and the constant threat of sudden wind shifts that could turn a safe corridor into a death trap in seconds. Colonel James Harrison, the squadron commander, addressed the pilots with grave seriousness. "This is voluntary assignment only. The risks are significant. We need one bird in the air to guide that convoy out, but I won't order anyone to fly into those conditions." The silence that followed was heavy with tension. Rachel watched through the doorway as the pilots exchanged glances, each waiting for someone else to volunteer. Blake studied his hands. Stone found something fascinating about his flight manual. One by one, they offered reasons why they couldn't take the mission. "My bird's been having intermittent avionics issues," Blake said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "Had some flickering on the heads-up display during yesterday's training run. Probably not safe to trust in zero visibility conditions." Stone nodded gravely. "And my throttle response has been sluggish. Noticed it during the last maintenance check. Could be dangerous if I need rapid power adjustments in those thermals." The excuses continued, each one technically valid but conveniently timed. Rachel felt a cold knot form in her stomach as she realized what was happening. These men, who had mocked her dedication to safety protocols, were now using those same protocols to avoid a mission that truly mattered. Commander Walsh noticed Rachel watching and followed her gaze. "Looks like the pilots are having some technical discussions," she said quietly. "I hope they figure it out soon. That convoy doesn't have much time." Through the radio, the voices from the trapped convoy grew more desperate. "Edwards Base, the fire's moving faster now. We can see flames on 3 sides. My kids are scared, and the smoke is getting thicker. Please, we need help now." Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, a familiar feeling from her pilot training. Days when everything clicked into place. She looked at the tactical display, studying the fire patterns and wind conditions. Her mind automatically began calculating flight paths, identifying the narrow corridor where the fire hadn't yet converged. She'd flown this route in simulators dozens of times, practicing low-altitude navigation through difficult terrain. The valley's topography was etched in her memory from countless training exercises. She knew every ridge, every thermal pattern, every trick of wind and weather that could trap an unwary pilot. More importantly, she understood something the others seemed to have forgotten. This wasn't about personal glory or career advancement. This was about 40 families trapped in a burning valley, waiting for someone brave enough to guide them home. In the pilot's briefing room, the excuses were running out. Colonel Harrison's face grew grimmer with each passing minute. "Gentlemen, I need a volunteer. We're running out of time." Blake shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, maybe. We should wait for the fire to shift. Sometimes these things create their own weather patterns, and there is no time to wait." Harrison's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Those people will be dead in 2 hours if we don't act now." Rachel made her decision. She stepped away from her medical station and walked toward the briefing room, her heart pounding but her resolve crystal clear. Every eye turned toward her as she appeared in the doorway, still wearing her medical uniform, still carrying the field kit that marked her as support personnel rather than a pilot. But her voice, when she spoke, carried the unmistakable authority of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. "Sir," she said, addressing Colonel Harrison directly, "I can fly that mission." The silence that followed was deafening. Blake's mouth actually fell open. Stone looked like he'd seen a ghost. The other pilots stared at her with expressions ranging from disbelief to something that might have been shame. Colonel Harrison studied her carefully. "Lieutenant Quinn, you're assigned to medical support. This is a combat mission requiring." "Sir, I'm fully qualified on the F-35B Lightning II. I have over 200 hours in type, including low-altitude tactical navigation and adverse weather operations. I know this terrain, I understand the risks, and I'm ready to go." She reached into her kit and pulled out a folder she'd been carrying for 3 years. Her original pilot qualification documents, her training records, her flight certifications. All still valid, all still current, just buried under bureaucratic indifference. "I've been maintaining proficiency in the simulators, sir. My last check ride was 8 months ago. I passed with scores in the 95th percentile. I'm not just ready for this mission. I'm the best qualified pilot available who's willing to fly it." The room was so quiet that the only sound was the distant crackle of radio traffic and the whisper of ash against the windows. Colonel Harrison took the folder and examined its contents, his eyebrows rising as he read through her qualifications. Blake finally found his voice. "You can't be serious. She's a medic. This is a job for real pilots." Rachel turned to face him, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and cold. "Then, where are the real pilots, Blake? Because all I see in this room are excuses and empty chairs." The tension in the briefing room was thick enough to cut with a blade. Colonel Harrison continued reading through Rachel's qualification papers, his expression growing more thoughtful with each page. The radio crackled with another desperate transmission from the trapped convoy. "Edwards Base. The smoke is getting so thick we can barely see 10 feet. The children are coughing badly. Please, if you're going to help us, it has to be now." Blake stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and something that looked suspiciously like fear. "This is ridiculous. You can't seriously be considering sending her up there. She's been playing medic for 3 years. Her flight status is ... questionable at best." "My flight status is perfectly valid," Rachel replied calmly, never taking her eyes off Colonel Harrison. "Every certification is current. Every requirement has been met. The only thing that's been questionable is the willingness of this squadron to let me use my qualifications." Stone jumped to Blake's defense. "Even if she's technically qualified, this mission requires experience with real combat conditions. Simulators are one thing, but actual flight in hostile conditions is exactly what I trained for." Rachel cut him off. "I've run this scenario dozens of times. Low-altitude navigation through smoke and fire, thermal avoidance, emergency extraction, procedures. I know every ridge and valley in that area from memory." Commander Walsh had been listening from the doorway. Now she stepped into the room, her medical training giving her a different perspective on the situation. "Colonel, I've worked with Lieutenant Quinn for 3 years." Her decision-making under pressure is exceptional. During today's civilian rescue, she remained calm and focused in conditions that would have rattled most people. If she says she can do this, I believe her. Colonel Harrison closed the folder and looked directly at Rachel. Lieutenant, I need to ask you something, and I need a completely honest answer. Are you volunteering for this mission because you're the best person for the job, or because you have something to prove? Rachel considered the question carefully. She could feel the weight of 3 years of mockery and dismissal pressing down on her shoulders. The temptation to prove herself was enormous, but that wasn't what mattered now. Sir, 40 families are trapped in that valley. Children are breathing smoke and ash while we debate qualifications. I'm volunteering because I'm the only pilot in this room who's willing to go, and because I have the skills to bring them home safely. My personal feelings about this assignment are irrelevant. The colonel studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's the right answer. He turned to the tactical display and pointed to the fire zone. Brief me on your approach. Rachel moved to the map, her confidence growing as she entered familiar territory. I'll approach from the northwest, using the ridgeline to mask my approach until I'm directly over the valley. The thermal columns are strongest on the eastern slope, so I'll stay west and use the natural wind patterns to maintain stable flight. She traced her finger along the proposed route. Once I've located the convoy, I'll establish a circular pattern above them at minimum safe altitude, probably around 500 feet, to stay below the worst of the smoke. I'll use my nav lights and flares to mark the safe corridor, guiding them along the old mining road that curves around the fire line. Blake scoffed. 500 feet? In those thermals? That's suicide. You'll get tossed around like a toy. Rachel didn't even look at him. The F-35B can handle the turbulence at that altitude. The real danger is flying too high and losing visual contact with the convoy. They need to see me to follow me out. Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly. What's your contingency if the fire shifts during the evacuation? There are 2 alternate routes, Rachel replied immediately. If the western corridor closes, I can guide them north through Miller's Pass. It's rougher terrain, but the fire hasn't reached that area yet. If both routes are compromised, I'll establish a defensive circle and call for additional air support. Additional air support from where? Stone asked skeptically. In case you haven't noticed, the whole region is on fire. From whoever's brave enough to fly when it matters. Rachel shot back, her patience with their negativity finally showing cracks. The radio crackled again, more urgently this time. Edwards Base. We can see flames coming over the eastern ridge. We don't have much time left. Colonel Harrison made his decision. Lieutenant Quinn, you have my authorization for this mission. Get suited up. Blake stepped forward, his face red with indignation. Sir, I formally protest this decision. Sending an unproven pilot on a mission like this is what, Captain Blake? Harrison's voice was ice cold. More dangerous than letting 40 civilians burn to death while our proven pilots find excuses to stay on the ground. Your protest is noted and dismissed. Rachel was already moving toward the door when Blake's voice stopped her. When you get yourself killed out there, Quinn, don't expect us to risk our necks pulling your wreckage out of the fire. She turned back to face him, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, she smiled. Blake, when I bring those families home safely, I want you to remember this moment. Remember how it felt to be too scared to do your job while someone you dismissed as just a medic stepped up to do it for you. The equipment room was organized chaos as Rachel quickly donned her flight gear. The familiar weight of the flight suit felt like coming home after a long exile. Her hands moved with automatic precision through the pre-flight checklist, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought might have faltered. Tom Rodriguez, the veteran mechanic who'd watched her practice in the simulators, appeared at her elbow. "I prepped Bird 7 for you," he said quietly. "She's not the prettiest, but she's solid. All systems checked, fuel topped off, and I double-checked everything myself." "Thank you, Tom," Rachel replied, pulling on her helmet. "That means more than you know." "Ma'am," Rodriguez continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "I've been working on these birds for 20 years. I know pilots, and you fly like one. Don't let those pretty boys in their pressed uniforms tell you different." Rachel squeezed his shoulder gratefully and headed toward the flight line. Outside, the smoke had thickened to the point where the runway lights were barely visible through the haze. The F-35B Lightning II waited for her like a patient predator, its sleek lines promising speed and power to those brave enough to claim it. As she performed her exterior inspection, she could see the other pilots watching from the hangar doorway. Their faces were painted in shades of orange and red from the distant fire, their expressions unreadable in the strange light. Blake stood at the front of the group, his arms crossed, his posture radiating skepticism and barely contained anger. Rachel completed her inspection and climbed into the cockpit. The familiar embrace of the pilot's seat felt like a reunion with an old friend. Her hands found the controls automatically, every switch and button exactly where memory insisted it would be. The engine spooled up with a rising whine that cut through the smoke-filled air like a promise. Through her canopy, she could see the ground crew clearing the area, their movements quick and professional despite the unusual circumstances of this launch. The radio crackled in her headset. "Phoenix 7, you are cleared for takeoff. Godspeed, Lieutenant." Phoenix 7, her old call sign, pulled from some dusty file and restored for this mission. Rachel felt a surge of emotion that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with coming home. "Tower, Phoenix 7 acknowledges. Taking off now." The F-35B lifted from the tarmac with smooth, powerful grace, leaving the ground and all its petty politics behind. Below her, the base grew smaller until it was just another collection of lights in a world gone mad with fire and smoke. Ahead lay the burning valley, the trapped families, and the chance to prove that true courage had nothing to do with rank insignia or squadron politics. Rachel pointed the nose of her fighter toward the inferno and pushed the throttle forward. It was time to fly. The F-35B climbed steadily through layers of smoke that turned the world into shades of hell. At 2,000 feet, Rachel broke through the thickest layer and caught her first clear view of the disaster below. The fire had spread faster than anyone had predicted, creating a horseshoe of flame that surrounded the valley where the civilian convoy waited. From the air, the scene looked like a vision from Dante's Inferno. Orange and red tongues of flame licked at the sky, creating thermal columns that rose like pillars of superheated air. The smoke plumes twisted and writhed in patterns that seemed almost alive, fed by winds that shifted without warning. Between the flames, Rachel could make out the tiny cluster of vehicles huddled in the valley's center, 40 families, whose lives now depended on her ability to navigate through this aerial minefield. "Edwards Base, Phoenix 7, she radioed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. "I have visual on the fire perimeter. Beginning approach to the valley now." "Copy, Phoenix 7. The convoy is monitoring emergency frequency 121.5. They're waiting for your signal." Rachel switched frequencies and heard the frightened but determined voice of the convoy leader, a man named David Chen, who had emerged as their unofficial coordinator. "Air support, this is convoy leader. We can hear your engines. The fire has closed off our eastern route completely, and the smoke is getting worse. We have children here who are having trouble breathing. Convoy leader, this is Phoenix 7. I see you. I'm going to mark a safe route out of the valley. When I give the signal, follow my lights exactly. Do not deviate from the path I show you, no matter what you see on the ground. Trust the route I'm marking." Copy, Phoenix 7. We're ready to move on your command. Rachel began her descent into the smoke, feeling the first buffets of thermal turbulence as she approached the fire line. The F-35B shuddered and bucked like a living thing as it encountered the violent air currents created by the massive conflagration below. Her instruments flickered as heat distortion played havoc with the optical systems, but she pressed on, using every skill she'd learned in 3 years of secret practice. At 800 feet, the heat became intense enough to trigger warning alarms. At 600 feet, the smoke was so thick that she was flying almost entirely on instruments. At 500 feet, she could feel the thermal updrafts trying to flip her aircraft like a leaf in a hurricane. But Rachel had prepared for this. Every night in the simulators, she'd practiced flying in conditions that other pilots dismissed as impossible. She'd studied the physics of fire behavior, learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished between safe air and deadly thermal traps. Now that knowledge served her well as she threaded the needle between towering columns of superheated air. She found the convoy huddled in a small clearing, their vehicles arranged in a defensive circle like covered wagons on an ancient frontier. Through brief gaps in the smoke, she could see people looking up at her aircraft, their faces pale with hope and terror. Convoy leader, I have eyes on your position. I'm going to activate my navigation strobes and begin marking your route out. The path will take you northwest, then curve back east once we clear the main fire line. Stay tight, stay together, and follow my lights. Rachel activated her external lighting system, turning her fighter into a beacon that cut through the smoke like a sword of light. She began a careful circular pattern above the convoy, using her nav lights and controlled flare deployments to mark the beginning of the escape route. The route she'd chosen was treacherous and narrow corridor between 2 advancing fire fronts that would require precise timing and absolute trust between pilot and convoy. Too fast, and the vehicles would fall behind and lose sight of her lights in the smoke. Too slow, and the shifting fire lines might close the corridor before they could escape. Phoenix 7, beginning movement now, Chun's voice crackled through the radio. Following your lights. Rachel began the delicate dance of aerial shepherding, maintaining just enough altitude to avoid the worst thermal turbulence while staying low enough for the convoy to track her position. The F-35B bucked and rolled as she flew through pockets of superheated air, but she maintained her course with the steady precision of a surgeon. Behind her, the convoy began to move. 40 vehicles, carrying families who had lost everything except their lives, followed the moving constellation of lights through a landscape that looked like the surface of an alien world. Rachel could hear their radio chatter, parents comforting children, drivers calling out hazards, Chun's voice holding them together with calm authority. The first quarter mile went smoothly. The fire had burned through this area hours earlier, leaving behind a moonscape of ash and twisted metal that was navigable if not pretty. But as they approached the active fire line, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The thermal activity intensified, bouncing Rachel's aircraft like a ball in a hurricane. Her altitude varied wildly as updrafts launched her skyward, then downdrafts slammed her toward the ground. The temperature in the cockpit climbed despite the environmental systems running at maximum, and she could taste smoke seeping through the air filtration system. Phoenix 7, we're having trouble seeing your lights through the smoke, Chun reported, his voice tight with concern. The lead vehicles are okay, but the ones at the back are falling behind. Rachel made a split-second decision that would have horrified every flight safety instructor she'd ever known. She dropped even lower, bringing her fighter to barely 300 feet above the ground, while below the recommended safe altitude for the conditions. At this height, she was dancing on the edge of disaster. One wrong thermal could slam her into the ground before she could recover, but the convoy needed to see her lights. I have you now, Chun called out with relief. All vehicles are tracking your position. The critical moment came as they approached the narrowest part of the corridor. Here, two fire fronts were converging, creating a gap that was closing by the minute. Rachel could see through her smoke-fogged canopy that they had perhaps 10 minutes before the route would be completely blocked. "Convoy leader, we need to increase speed," she radioed. "The route ahead is going to close soon." "Copy, Phoenix." 7. All vehicles increase to maximum safe speed. Stay in formation. Rachel pushed her fighter forward, her lights carving a path through the darkness ahead. The thermal activity was extreme now, threatening to tear her aircraft apart with every passing second. Her control surfaces groaned under the stress, and she could hear the airframe creaking as it fought against forces that were beyond its design. Specifications. Then disaster struck. A massive thermal updraft caught the F-35B like a giant's fist, launching it upward so violently that Rachel's vision grayed from the G-forces. The fighter shot up through 1,000 feet in seconds, carrying her far above the convoy and into the thick smoke layer where visibility was zero. When she fought the aircraft back down to operational altitude, her heart stopped. The convoy had scattered. In the few seconds she'd been out of sight, the vehicles had become separated in the smoke and confusion. Some had continued forward, following their last glimpse of her lights. Others had stopped, afraid to continue without visual contact. A few had turned in the wrong direction entirely. "Phoenix 7, Phoenix 7. Chun's voice was desperate now. "We've lost sight of you. Half the convoy doesn't know which way to go." Rachel looked at her fuel gauges. She had perhaps 20 minutes of flying time left at this altitude and power setting. The scattered convoy would take at least that long to reorganize and complete the evacuation, even if everything went perfectly from here. She was faced with a pilot's nightmare: insufficient fuel to complete the mission by conventional means. In training, this would be the point where she would abort and return to base, accepting the loss as unavoidable. But these weren't training scenarios. These were real families with real children who would die if she failed them now. Rachel made her choice. She reduced power to extend her fuel range, accepted the increased risk of thermal damage, and began the most dangerous flying of her career. "Convoy leader, this is Phoenix 7. I'm coming back down to guide you out. When you see my lights, reorganize into a single column and follow me. We're going to make this work." She dove back into the maelstrom, her fighter screaming through thermals that threatened to tear it apart. But Rachel Quinn, call sign Phoenix, had earned her name by rising from the ashes of failure. Tonight, she would live up to it completely. The real test was just beginning. Rachel pushed the F-35B into a steep dive, plunging back toward the scattered convoy with her engines at minimum power to conserve fuel. The thermal turbulence was worse now, the fire having intensified and spread during the precious minutes. They'd lost. Her aircraft bucked and rolled like an angry beast as she fought to maintain control in air that seemed more liquid than gas. Below her, the convoy was in chaos. Through brief gaps in the smoke, she could see vehicles stopped at various points along the route, their headlights creating a scattered constellation of hope in the darkness. Some had continued following her last known direction and were dangerously close to the advancing eastern fire line. Others had stopped completely, afraid to move without guidance. A few had actually turned around and were heading back toward the trap they'd started from. "Phoenix 7, this is convoy leader." Chun's voice crackled through the radio, strained but still controlled. "I count 37 vehicles in visual contact, but 3 are missing. The Johnson family's SUV, the Martini's truck, and one of the medical transport vans broke off when we lost sight of you." Rachel's heart clenched. She was responsible for every life in that convoy, and she'd already lost track of 3 vehicles carrying at least a dozen people. The guilt threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced it down. There would be time for self-recrimination later if she survived long enough. Copy, convoy leader. I'm going to re-establish the guidance pattern. All vehicles need to form a single column and follow my lights exactly. No exceptions, no deviations. We have maybe 10 minutes before this corridor closes completely. She activated her external lights again, creating a brilliant beacon in the smoke-filled darkness. One by one, the scattered vehicles began to respond, their headlights converging on her position like moths drawn to flame. The reorganization was taking precious time they didn't have, but it was working. That's when the real crisis hit. Phoenix 7. A new voice broke into the frequency, young female, scared. This is Amy Johnson. We're lost. We followed what we thought were your lights, but now we're surrounded by fire on 3 sides. Our engine is overheating, and we can smell smoke inside the car. Please, we have 2 small children with us. Rachel's blood turned to ice. The Johnson family had followed the wrong lights, probably the glow from the fire itself, and driven directly into the eastern fire line. They were trapped in a pocket that would be completely overrun within minutes. Amy, this is Phoenix 7. Can you see my aircraft lights right now? No, we can't see anything but smoke and fire. The heat is getting worse. Our car is starting to make strange noises. Rachel looked at her fuel gauge. She had maybe 15 minutes of flying time left, enough to guide the main convoy to safety or to search for the lost vehicles, but not both. The choice that every pilot dreaded was staring her in the face. Save the many or risk them all trying to save the few. From the main convoy, Chun's voice came through with barely controlled desperation. Phoenix 7, we can see flames jumping. The road ahead of us. If we don't move now, we're going to be cut off. 37 vehicles with over 100 people, including dozens of children, versus 3 vehicles with perhaps 12 souls. The mathematics of survival were brutal and clear. Any reasonable pilot would choose to save the larger group and accept the loss of the smaller one as tragic but unavoidable. But Rachel had never been interested in being reasonable. She'd spent 3 years being dismissed and overlooked, precisely because she refused to accept losses that others considered inevitable. Convoy leader, hold position for 2 minutes. I'm going after the lost vehicles. Phoenix 7, you don't have the fuel for this. The fire is moving too fast. 2 minutes, Rachel repeated, her voice allowing no argument. Trust me. She banked the F-35B sharply to the east, diving toward the area where the Johnsons were trapped. The thermal activity here was beyond extreme. Her aircraft was being tossed around like a paper airplane in a tornado. Warning alarms screamed in her headset as the fighter systems registered temperatures and stress loads well beyond normal operational parameters. Through the chaos, she spotted a faint glimmer of headlights nearly surrounded by advancing flame. The Johnson family's SUV was trapped in a small clearing, with fire advancing from 3 directions and only one narrow escape route remaining, a route that would close within minutes. Amy, I have visual on your position. I need you to do exactly what I tell you when I tell you. Can you do that? Yes, we're ready. Please hurry. Rachel dropped even lower, bringing her fighter to barely 200 feet above the ground. At this altitude, she was essentially flying through the fire itself. Her aircraft's heat shields and environmental systems pushed far beyond their design limits. The canopy was starting to fog from the extreme temperature differential, and she could smell burning electronics from somewhere in the cockpit. Amy, I'm going to light up the escape route with flares. When you see them, drive straight toward the brightest light and don't stop for anything. The path is narrow, but it will get you out. Rachel triggered her emergency flare system, sending brilliant white-hot magnesium flares arcing through the smoke to mark the only safe passage. The flares carved a corridor of light through the darkness, showing the SUV exactly where to go. "I see them. We're moving now." The Johnson family's SUV lurched forward, following the line of flares through the narrow gap between two walls of advancing flame. Rachel paced them from above, using her remaining flares to mark hazards and course corrections. Her fuel gauge was deep in the red. Now, she had perhaps 5 minutes of flying time left. "Phoenix 7, this is Amy. We're clear. We can see the main road ahead. 1 down, 2 to go." But as Rachel turned to search for the Martinez truck and the medical van, her worst fears were realized. Her fuel warning system activated with a series of urgent chimes that meant she was down to emergency reserves. She had maybe 3 minutes of powered flight left before the engines would shut down automatically. The choice was no longer between saving the few or the many. Now it was about whether she could save anyone at all before her fighter became a falling piece of metal and debris. In the distance, she could see the glow of the main convoy's headlights. Chun was holding them in position as ordered, but the fire was closing in on their location too. Every second she spent searching for the remaining lost vehicles was a second closer to losing the entire group. Her radio crackled with a new transmission. "Phoenix 7, this is Martinez. We found the medical van. Both vehicles are together, but we're trapped in a box canyon. The fire came around behind us. There's no way out on the ground." Rachel closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on her. She looked at her fuel gauge one more time, then at the tactical display showing the positions of all 3 groups, the main convoy waiting for her guidance, the Johnson family racing toward safety, and the final 2 vehicles trapped with no ground escape route. In that moment, she understood what it truly meant to be a pilot. It wasn't about the glory or the recognition. It wasn't about proving herself to people like Blake, who would never respect her anyway. It was about making the choice to risk everything for people you'd never met, because that's what the job demanded when everything else was stripped away. Rachel pushed the throttle forward one last time, her engines drinking the last drops of fuel as she dove toward the trapped vehicles. She had one chance to save them all, but it would require her to do something that no pilot was ever supposed to consider. She was going to have to land. The F-35B's fuel warning alarm had evolved from urgent chimes to a steady, shrieking wail that filled the cockpit like the cry of a dying animal. Rachel's display showed what she already knew in her gut. She had less than 2 minutes of powered flight remaining before the engines would flame out completely. Below her, the Martinez truck and the medical van were trapped in a box canyon with walls of fire advancing from 3 sides. "Martinez, this is Phoenix 7. I need you to listen very carefully. I'm going to attempt a landing near your position. When I touch down, I want both vehicles to drive as close to my aircraft as possible and wait for my signal." "Phoenix 7. Did you say landing? There's no runway down here. Just rough ground, and I'm not looking for a runway. The F-35B has vertical landing capability. I can set down in a space the size of a tennis court if I have to." What Rachel didn't mention was that vertical landing required enormous amounts of fuel for the lift fan and maneuvering thrusters, fuel she didn't have. She was going to attempt something that was barely possible under ideal conditions with a fighter that was already operating on fumes. She selected the vertical landing mode and felt the F-35B's configuration change as the lift fan behind the cockpit activated and the main engine nozzle rotated downward. The aircraft slowed dramatically, transitioning from forward flight to a powered hover that consumed fuel at a catastrophic rate. Below her, a small clearing in the canyon offered just enough space for a landing, if she could thread the needle, between burning trees and rock walls in zero visibility conditions. Rachel descended through the smoke, flying entirely on instruments and instinct, feeling for the ground that she couldn't see. At 50 feet, She caught a glimpse of the two trapped vehicles through a gap in the smoke. At 30 feet, her proximity sensors started screaming warnings about obstacles on all sides. At 10 feet, she could feel the heat from the surrounding fires cooking the underside of her aircraft. The F-35B touched down hard on the rocky canyon floor just as the fuel flow warning lights began flashing. She had perhaps 30 seconds of power remaining, enough for one vertical takeoff if everything went perfectly, but not enough for any mistakes or delays. "Martinez, medical van, drive to my aircraft now. We have 30 seconds before my engines shut down." The two vehicles lurched forward across the rough ground, their drivers pushing their vehicles harder than they'd ever been designed to go. The Martinez truck, a heavy-duty pickup, reached her first. Behind it came the medical van, its occupants, an elderly couple, and their disabled grandson, visible through the windshield. But as they approached, Rachel realized the horrible truth. The F-35B was designed to carry one pilot, not to evacuate civilians. There was no way to get these people aboard her aircraft, and no way to evacuate them on the ground with the fire closing in. She was facing the ultimate pilot's nightmare. She had the power to save herself, but not the people she'd come to rescue. That's when inspiration struck. Rachel remembered something from her medical training: the external rescue hoist that some military aircraft carried for combat search and rescue operations. The F-35B didn't have one, but it did have external hardpoints designed for carrying weapons or equipment. "Martinez, I need you to get everyone out of the vehicles and gather directly beneath my aircraft. I'm going to try something that's never been done before." Rachel activated her emergency equipment bay and deployed the aircraft's emergency escape. Rope a 200-foot line designed to allow pilots to rappel from disabled aircraft. It wasn't rated for multiple people, and it certainly wasn't designed for what she was planning, but it was the only chance they had. "I'm lowering the line. I need the strongest person to tie it around their waist and hold on to as many others as possible. We're going to lift out of here together." Below her, she could see Martinez organizing the group. There were 7 people, total too many for any reasonable interpretation of the rope's weight limit. But Rachel had moved far beyond reasonable interpretations of anything tonight. Martinez secured the rope around his waist and gathered the others close, his wife and teenage daughter, the elderly couple from the medical van, their disabled grandson, and the van's driver. They formed a human chain, each person holding tight to the next, their lives literally hanging by a thread. Rachel's fuel gauges were deep in the red, the engines running on vapor. She had one chance to get this right. She pushed the throttle to maximum power and pulled up on the collective, feeling the F-35B strain against the impossible load. The fighter lurched upward, carrying its human cargo with agonizing slowness. The engines screamed in protest, consuming the last drops of fuel as they fought against gravity and the weight of 7 souls. Rachel could feel the aircraft shuddering on the edge of a stall, every control input requiring perfect precision to maintain the delicate balance between lift and catastrophic failure. 50 feet up, the first engine warning light illuminated. 100 feet, and she could hear the pitch of the engines beginning to change as fuel flow decreased. 150 feet, and she cleared the canyon walls, flying over the advancing fire line with her human cargo dangling below. At 200 feet, the engines finally gave up. The fuel flow stopped completely, and the F-35B transitioned from powered flight to controlled descent in the space of heartbeats. But they were clear of the fire, over safer ground where the convoy could reach them. "All vehicles, this is Phoenix 7, Rachel radioed, her voice still steady despite everything. "I'm going down north of the canyon. I have 7 survivors with me. I need immediate pickup at my crash site." She aimed for the clearest patch of ground she could see through the smoke, brought the F-35B's nose up to bleed off forward speed, and prepared for a dead-stick landing that would either save them all or kill them all. The fighter hit the ground hard, bouncing twice before sliding to a stop in a shower of sparks and debris. The external rope and its human cargo came down roughly but safely beside the aircraft, Martinez and the others tumbling in a heap that was chaotic but miraculously uninjured. Rachel shut down the electrical systems and popped the canopy, breathing smoke-filled air that tasted like freedom. Around her, she could hear the sound of approaching vehicles as the convoy raced toward their position. She had done it. Against all odds, against every regulation and safety protocol, against the doubts of everyone who had dismissed her as just a medic, she had brought them all home. But the night wasn't over yet. The convoy vehicles surrounded Rachel's crashed F-35B like cavalry forming a protective circle, their headlights cutting through the smoke to illuminate a scene that looked like something from a fever dream. There, fighter jet sat crumpled on the rocky ground, its landing gear collapsed, its fuselage scorched and dented from the impossible mission it had just completed. Beside it, 7 people sat in stunned silence, alive because of a pilot who had refused to accept the mathematics of loss. Rachel climbed down from the cockpit on unsteady legs, her flight suit soaked with sweat, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion. She'd just accomplished something that would be talked about in aviation circles for decades, if anyone believed it actually happened. A vertical takeoff rescue of 7 civilians using emergency rope, followed by a dead-stick landing in zero visibility conditions. It was the kind of flying that existed only in Hollywood movies and pilot folklore, but there was no time for celebration yet. The fire was still advancing, and they needed to get everyone to safety before the wind shifted again. David Chun jumped out of the lead vehicle and ran toward her, his face a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Phoenix 7, are you injured? Can you travel?" "I'm fine," Rachel replied, though her voice was hoarse from breathing smoke for the past hour. "How's the convoy?" "Everyone accounted for. All 40 vehicles, all families safe thanks to you." Chun's voice broke slightly. "What you just did, I don't have words for it." Behind him, Martinez approached with his family, the elderly couple and the van driver. The teenage daughter was crying, not from fear now, but from the overwhelming relief of being alive. The disabled grandson, a boy of perhaps 12, looked up at Rachel with eyes wide with hero worship. "You saved us," Martinez said simply. "You crashed your plane to save people you didn't even know." Rachel shook her head. "The plane was already going down. I just made sure it went down in the right place." But even as she downplayed her actions, she could see the faces around her convoy members emerging from their vehicles. Ground crew arriving in rescue trucks, base personnel who had driven out to assist with the evacuation. They all looked at her differently now. The dismissive glances and skeptical smirks were gone, replaced by something she hadn't seen in 3 years: genuine respect. The evacuation to the base proceeded smoothly after that. Rachel rode in one of the rescue vehicles, watching through the rear window as teams worked to secure her crashed fighter. The F-35B was damaged beyond repair, but it had died completing its mission, the best end any combat aircraft could ask for. Back at Edwards Air Force Base, the returning convoy was met by medical teams, base personnel, and a cluster of news crews who had somehow gotten word of the dramatic rescue. The story was already spreading. A military medic had taken an unauthorized fighter jet and flown a suicide mission to save trapped civilians, accomplishing one of the most daring rescues in aviation history. Rachel tried to avoid the cameras and reporters, but there was no hiding from what she'd done. As she walked across the tarmac toward the debriefing center, she passed the hangar where the fighter pilots were gathered. The same men who had mocked her that morning now stood in uncomfortable silence, their eyes following her progress with expressions that ranged from shame to something approaching awe. Blake was there, his usual arrogance completely deflated. When their eyes met, he looked away quickly, unable to hold her gaze. Stone stood beside him, fidgeting with his flight gloves like a nervous schoolboy. The others found sudden interest in their boots or the horizon, anywhere but the woman who had shown them what courage actually looked like. Colonel Harrison was waiting for her outside the briefing room, his face serious but warm. "Lieutenant Quinn, there's going to be an investigation, of course. You flew an unauthorized mission in a combat aircraft, violated multiple safety protocols, and destroyed a multi-million-dollar fighter jet." Rachel straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever consequences were coming. "Yes, sir. I understand." "However," Harrison continued, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction, "you also saved 43 lives, including 7 who would certainly have died without your intervention. The preliminary report from the convoy leader describes your flying as beyond anything we thought was possible, and the fact that you accomplished this rescue while officially assigned to medical support." He shook his head in amazement. "Sir, about my flight status has been fully restored as of this moment," Harrison interrupted. "In fact, I'm recommending you for immediate reassignment to active flight duty. We need pilots with your skills and judgment in our squadron, not hidden away in the medical corps." The investigation that followed was more formality than genuine inquiry. The evidence was overwhelming. Rachel had prevented a humanitarian disaster through exceptional airmanship and personal courage. The crashed F-35B was ruled an acceptable loss given the lives saved. Her technical violations of protocol were officially noted but not prosecuted, given the extraordinary circumstances. More importantly, the truth about her original grounding finally came to light. Major Wells, faced with an investigation into his past actions, quietly admitted that he had used his influence to sideline Rachel after she'd been proven right about the hydraulic failure. The revelation sent shockwaves through the command structure and resulted in Wells' forced retirement under less than honorable circumstances. 3 weeks later, Rachel stood on the flight line in her new duty assignment as a squadron pilot, watching the morning briefing through the hangar window. The dynamics had changed completely. Blake and Stone still flew their missions, but their swagger was gone, replaced by a grudging professionalism. They no longer made jokes about real pilots or mocked the capabilities of others. Tom Rodriguez approached with her pre-flight checklist for the day's training mission routine combat maneuvers in clear skies, a far cry from the hell she'd flown through to earn her place back where she belonged. "How's it feel to be back where you should have been all along?" he asked with a grin. Rachel looked at the F-35B waiting for her new aircraft to replace the one she'd sacrificed for 7 strangers. Its wings gleamed in the morning sun, its lines sharp and powerful and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. "It feels like coming home," she replied. As she walked toward her fighter, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 3 years of mockery and dismissal. 3 years of being told she wasn't good enough. 3 years of proving herself in secret, while others claimed the spotlight she deserved. But in the end, when it truly mattered, when lives hung in the balance, and courage was more important than politics, she had been ready. She had been the pilot the situation demanded, not because of her rank or her connections, but because of her skills and her willingness to risk everything for people who needed help. The phoenix on her old call sign patch had been more prophetic than she'd realized. She had risen from the ashes of bureaucratic burial, transformed by fire into something stronger and more determined than before. Rachel climbed into her cockpit and began her pre-flight checklist, her hands moving with the easy confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Above her, the desert sky stretched wide and blue and limitless, full of possibilities that no one could take away from her now. The engines spooled up with their familiar rising whine, and Phoenix 7 prepared for takeoff. But this time, she wasn't flying into fire and chaos. She was flying toward a future where her skills would be recognized, her judgment trusted, and her courage valued for what it was, the mark of a true pilot. Behind her in the hangar, Blake watched through the window as she taxied toward the runway. For a moment, their eyes met through the canopy glass. This time, he didn't look away. Instead, he raised his hand in a slow, respectful salute, the acknowledgement of one pilot to another, and the recognition that true worth isn't given by others, but earned through actions when everything is on the line. Rachel returned the salute briefly, then focused on the runway ahead. She had proven everything she needed to prove. Now it was time to simply fly, and to remember that sometimes the greatest victories come not from those who claim the spotlight, but from those who step up when the spotlight finds them, whether they want it or not. The F-35B lifted from the tarmac and climbed toward the clear blue sky, carrying with it the quiet satisfaction of a mission accomplished and a life reclaimed. In the end, that was all any pilot could ask for, the chance to do the job they were trained for when it mattered most, with skill and courage and the knowledge that they had made a difference. Phoenix 7 was airborne, and the sky belonged to her once again. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.